Next that I want to cover are not auth router, but I will router is actually something that was already there in common. So common dot router and this router are same. So it's something that is available directly on API. So you don't have to call api.common.router.getView route. Instead, you can say api.router.getViewRoute. So entity will come to entity, and both of them are available on backend as well. Common, most of the things that we talked about in common are available in backend. Logic, filter, and entity, the APIs are also available in backend. So EM, entity, filter, common are available in backend. Trigger is also available in backend. Session is not available in backend. Globals is only in the UI, right? Of course, icon, uh, DOM are not relevant for backend. All right, so let's get into entity first. Entity, like common, has so many functionalities, but what we are going to understand is the first few interfaces that are defined are here. So we have a data type or an interface called category, entity category, which is basically defining the entire structure of a data category. Let's understand the relationship between category and entity again. So category is the data type definition. And what is data type? When we have to deal with data of multiple data points or multiple copies of similar type of data, then we define it as a data category. In a traditional our relational database management system design approach, these are called tables. So every data entity will have a equivalent table definition. Here, we are not storing things in tables or not even thinking in terms of tables. We are thinking those as objects, JavaScript objects or JSONs. So a data entity is basically an equivalent of a JSON or JavaScript object or a document, if we can say like that. And document is nothing but a hierarchical, tree structured set of key value pairs. Okay, so typical JSON. So category is about the structure given to that content. Now, by default, MongoDB is a NoSQL, no structure database, very flexible. But because we are not telling the world that we are storing the data in MongoDB, and also to have some logic, we need to define this type of the data. Then only we can have some control over the data. Control while accepting a new entry, while modifying the entry, while displaying the entry, we can have some control. So type definition is important, and a particular data type is defined as category or entity category, to be specific. In this entity category will have properties. So each category will have a unique ID and descriptive name as well as a bunch of properties. And now, fine. So that is the fundamental of this platform. You have categories defined, we have properties inside the categories defined, and then the platform takes care of the life cycle. It gives you a lot of ways to create and primarily inquire or filter the objects or modify the entities that you have. So I will quickly jump to that part, which is available in entity constants, because this is what is available as your API, api.entity. So let's get into the common functionalities available through entity. So it has a whole lot of constants. The most important constants that we use are um, prop type. So prop type is something that we will use occasionally. Everything else is generally not used because these are used otherwise in configurations, the property configurations that we have. So these are constants over there. Role, you can see out of box roles, anonymous, authenticator, and administrator. Some validators like required, unique, and system ID, JSON, and email. All other are not supported right now. Various operation types, various events, the life cycle events on entity. Very rarely to be used. Is entity type. When I have a property definition, and rather when I pass a prop type of a properties type, data type, I need to decide if it is entity type or not. So it's a convenience function. Basically, it matches with uh, at entity prop type or at entity inline proper type. And if it matches, then it says, yes, this property type is of type entity, otherwise not. Used occasionally because I already know what are the possible types. So I can check with those individually, or I can call this convenience method. Get common props. Now, every entity by default will have some predefined properties. I have been telling you 3 properties are mandatory, which are underscore ID, app underscore ID, and category. In addition to that, when an entity is created, it will get created by ID, it will get created on, it will get last modified by ID. When I say ID, it is the user's reference, who is the person. So these are related to a person. You see, created by ID refers to a category called person. Data type is entity. Similarly, for last modified by ID, data type is entity and category is person. And then last modified on. So these are few additional fields that will always get added apart from the UUID, the unique ID. Attribute, this is underscore ID, right? So underscore ID, app underscore ID, category, and then 4 life related, created by, created on, modified by, modified on. So you can expect at least 7 properties in any entity that you are getting created through the platform. Okay, now it's really difficult to do it manually, so you are mostly doing it through UI. Now, in some cases, you will not set the time, etc., because that needs to be set by the system. For such scenarios, there are some logic already written. What you actually do is make a call to some functions. And the most common function that we use is save. And save is actually called on entity. Okay. So entity constant, first of all, let's find out what function that we call in entity. API.entity, we most of the time we call build. This is the most common function that we call. So we pass an object, and from that object we are doing a safe parse. You see that logic is coming here, safe parse of common, and we are doing a check type, and then finally we prepare an object of type base entity, a new object of base entity. Now you don't have to worry about what base entity is. It's basically wrapping up the definition of a particular category. But it is an object because base entity will have several other functions. So a regular JSON is transformed into a full-fledged inflated entity object. A regular JSON string is or object is transformed into a full-fledged entity object, and type of that is base entity. We will now jump into this to find out what additional, it returns an instance of base entity, right? So the next action that we do is dot reload most of the time. So build, and then we say reload. So reload is now available on base entity. Okay. We rarely create base entity directly. We will never actually create a direct instance. Instead, if I want to have a base entity of a particular category, empty one, then we call this function build empty and pass the category ID, and it will create a base entity. But the problem with this is it will not set the app ID. So now if I want to preset the app ID as well as category, so 2 out of 3 mandatory properties I want to set, because third one I will set when I'm actually doing the create, storing it in the database. So for that, setting 2 properties simultaneously, I have another convenience method called create. So I say category ID and app ID, both will be set, and then that entity will be returned. So ultimately what you are getting is an instance of base entity. So let's get inside this. Base entity will give me some additional things. So for example, reload. So this is something that we commonly use. And what happens in reload? It's an async function. That's why we always put await before that function call if we want to retain the value. And it is doing what? It is using a entity service, get entity service on constant. So once again, this is and entity service function takes 2 arguments, the app ID and the category ID. Now both are available in the base entity because base entity will always have 3 things, as I said, underscore ID, app ID, and category. So app ID and category IDs are retrieved and a service is being called. Now service or entity service will again provide you a whole lot of utility functions. So right now, what function it is called? It is calling find by ID. So I'm saying, okay, uh, I first got a entity service, and then on that entity service, I'm saying find the object by this ID. So entity service has the context of app and category, and then I'm saying, hey, take this UUID and tell me if you have an object with this combination of ID, app ID, and category. And if you are getting it, bring it back to me. Where is it looking for? In the database. So this find by ID on entity service will have the next set of things. So entity service again basically gives you way to deal with the data and communicate with the backend. Communicate with backend means it will make a remote call to your corresponding backend server and say, here is my condition on these are my input conditions and give me a record matching with this. So the whole lot of filter conditions will be created, and then that filter criteria will be passed on to the backend, and backend will do an actual search in the database, and whatever matching records were found will come back to you. So that is what is being done here. So when I say find by ID, I am saying this is my ID. And then for this, it is basically creating an entity and then saying find records for this entity. Now, this is another interesting thing. So it is calling another utility function, which is giving me matching records for the given entity. So entity is nothing but a bunch of properties, right? 3 mandatory properties I said. Here it is creating uh, a new object, a fresh object with that ID, and that is basically having the category of this and ID that is given, and that is used internally for criteria creation. So let me go inside further in the find records. Now find records has got the entity. By now it has 2 properties in this entity. One is ID and second is category. Okay, and this entity service already knows what is the app ID for this, where exactly which database I need to look into. So it is looking for ID, name, description, status, and finally it will build it will call this find records by. So it's a chain of calls basically. Records by has multiple properties passed in, and then ID, name, description, status. You don't have, you very rarely you will call these, but these are lower level APIs. And then finally for this, it is making call to another function called find by, and find by will basically give me a JSON, and from JSON it will basically uh, build the records. So JSON will come from the backend. JSON means raw data. Now you actually want is an array of base entity object, not the raw data, but wrapped into the uh, instances of base entity. So that conversion will be done in build records, but finally, first of all, let me get that data. So by find by, and find by will do what? It will build the criteria. So again, building the criteria is done on entity constant, right? You see a lot of hops happening. And then build criteria is a functionality available on the constants directly. So this is directly available to me. I can build a criteria by passing category, ID, name, desk, status. And then it will build the criteria for me. And finally, my criteria is available. And then that is passed again to the find function of this service. Now, find function is doing what? Finally, this is making a remote service call. Okay, so here it is saying, okay, now call this API entity find and pass the condition like this. And so it is setting multiple things. So this was my condition or criteria. This is the session, the user who is actually making this request. Additional options, if there are any. For example, I want to say, okay, give me the 20 records, or skip first 20 and give me the remaining, those kind of things. And then on this app ID. So app ID is nothing but the database name. So app ID in this database for the given category, which is related to the table. And then in that table, look for these conditions match. So column wise matching, and then give me the record, matching record. So this entity find API actually does that. Now, all this is done so easily for you. You made a simple call called reload, and everything else is done by the system for you. That's the magic of this platform. If you had to do this on your own, you had to make all of these conversions, building the criteria, and then making a remote call, getting the data out, then verifying it, building the object, transform it into useful object again, and getting it back. Now, in this case, I just wanted one object, and it should be coming back in my reload. All that is wrapped up so nicely. And finally, what you get is a fully blown object of the given entity. So that was the magic of reload function, right? Now you are perhaps understanding how much complex the internal things could be if we have to write on our own. So many things have to be considered, so many layers of calls will have to go through, but the APIs available through the platform has already wrapped them up, and then we are making simple calls. I have got a reference to entity. An entity has 3 attributes: underscore ID, category, and app ID. And I say, using this, do a reload, find the matching object, and get it back to me. If you don't find it, give me undefined. That will tell me that, okay, so this combination doesn't exist.